Stephanie, and welcome everyone to this week's edition of Building Conversations. We've got another great show for you here today. Without further ado, let's get started. So June is Embodied Carbon Month at Building Conversations. And we know that as high performance buildings become the norm, operational carbon emissions will be reduced, but we must not forget embodied carbon emissions. And once again, we'll be talking about both types of carbon and the role that that we can play as designers, as engineers, as contractors and builders, the role we can play in reducing carbon emissions. So we know that Passive House is agnostic when it comes to building materials. And embodied carbon is currently not part of PHI standards, but Passive House Canada has been exploring how it can educate the design industry and support the use of low carbon building materials. So we'll be, as I said, we're incorporating discussions about embodied carbon in our show this month. So without further ado, a little bit about who I am. I'm Chris Ballard, CEO for the past 8 months now of Passive House Canada. I've been Ontario's Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Minister of Housing. Great job I had was municipal councillor. I've been a business owner. I've been executive director of a consumer advocacy organization. And before all of that, I was a journalist. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is that I've had the opportunity to look at the challenges we face with regards to the climate crisis and the role that carbon emissions and GHGs play in that. And I can say that Passive House standards for new and retrofit buildings answer many of our environmental and building challenges, including health and resilience, comfort, and low energy. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about Passive House Canada. We are a membership-based, not-for-profit advocacy organization. We do a lot of education and capacity building. We run events right across the country. We offer membership and technical services. We have staff in 6 cities now and instructors across Canada. We're primarily a group of architects and engineers, contractors and tradespeople and government decision makers. And the one thing that I like about Passive House Canada is we do more than talk. We are more than just policy folks. Our members like to get things done. They design, they build, they get their hands dirty. So when they speak, it's from a position of experience and not just theory. I'd like to welcome today's guest, Kathy Wardle. Kathy is a sustainable building consultant with Perkins & Will. Her passion for environmental stewardship gained her the title of being the first co-director of the firm's Sustainable Design Initiative, which really transformed Perkins & Will into the leading green practice that it is today. Kathy has led the studio's internal research department, and she believes, as you will hear, in balancing the protection of vital ecosystems with the business and personal aspirations of Perkins & Will clients. So welcome, Kathy. And I do know that Kathy has a family rooted in Vancouver design and real estate industries. She has been exposed to buildings from an early age. However, she says it was hiking through old growth forests on Vancouver Island and the tropical rainforests of South America that inspired her to pursue a career in this uncharted career path at its time. So we'll learn more about how Kathy got to where she is today in a few minutes. Let me start, before we move on with our conversation, to talk about Passive House building standards and Passive House Canada. This is one of my favorite slides of this show each week, because Passive House Canada and passive house standards really have their roots, their ancestry in Canada. This is Saskatchewan Conservation House, built in 1977 by Dr. Orr and co-workers, funded by the Saskatchewan government. It's in Regina. It was in response to the government trying to answer a very simple question: could we keep people warm in the face of an OPEC oil embargo? And this house still stands today. It is still lived in. It still performs to the same high standards that it was designed to work to. And it has been acknowledged by Passive House Institute as the ancestor or an ancestor of today's modern passive house standards. For those Canadians in the show, you can feel proud that that this place is part of our passive house ancestry. I can say that too often I hear from folks who think that passive house standards are European and really don't have anything to do with North America. You couldn't be further from the truth, because this house stands as an example of passive house work that's been done in Canada since 1977. So there we go with that. Moving along, people say, well, tell me about passive house design. What is it? There are really 5 principles of passive house design. And the first is that you need a super insulated envelope. The second is that you need airtight construction. The third is that you must be thermal bridge free. The fourth is that you have high quality windows with solar orientation, meaning that you let the warm sun in during the cold months and you keep the hot sun out during the months that you need your building to stay cool. And finally, that the ventilation, you have a ventilation system with heat recovery. And this is one of the reasons, the ventilation system is one of the key reasons that passive houses are very healthy places to live. The air is exchanged quite frequently. So those are the 5 principles of passive house design. You can learn more about what is a passive house on our website. In fact, if you sign up for our newsletter, we have an ebook that explains an awful lot more. Moving right along, and this is where I will invite Kathy to turn on her camera, and we're going to have a conversation. So welcome, Kathy, to Passive House Canada's Building Conversations. I'm your host.
Good morning, or good afternoon to everyone on the line.
Exactly, and it's wonderful to have you here, and it's really exciting to hear about what Perkins and Will is doing in the area of a carbon impact statement. But before we get there, I always like to know a little bit about the people we have on the show, and I read that statement earlier about how you got to where you are, but just fill us in a little bit more, because environmental studies was not something that people necessarily pursued many years ago. Not to say you were pursuing it many years ago, but.
No, it's been a few years. You know, it's interesting because I did my master's at Dalhousie University after traveling South America and seeing some tremendous devastation of the tropical rainforests, and I landed at Dalhousie at their School for Environmental Resource Management Studies. And I'm not an architect. I come at it more from an environmental science, environmental resource management perspective. And my thesis actually looked at opportunities for material recovery and specifically targeted the construction sector, trying to understand, you know, what are the opportunities to reuse, repurpose building materials and buildings, recognizing that at that time, construction waste represented probably 30 to 40% of our landfill waste. Wow. So I came at it more from a material recovery process, and you know, at the time, Busby and Associates, Peter Busby's firm, completed a building for the city of Vancouver that had reused about 75% of its materials came from salvage sources. And so that project was featured in my thesis. So I came at it more from a kind of material resource conservation perspective, looking at the building industry, and focused my research on Metro Vancouver and what was happening in the construction sector locally, because I'm from Vancouver originally, so I kind of focused my studies back on my kind of home turf. From there, I graduated right before 2011 or 2001, sorry, and the September 11th event, and I actually interviewed with Susan Goosh and Peter Busby. Susan's now our managing director, and the next day the world totally changed.
Right.
So there was no job opportunities at that point in time, but I really kind of stuck to my guns. I persevered and did some independent consulting on kind of corporate business social responsibility actions. And then 6 months later, Peter and Susan called me up and said, "Hey, are you still available? Because we have this client. It was the Greater Toronto Airports Authority, and they wanted to establish tenant guidelines for tenants moving into the airport space." And right at that time, LEED was coming into the marketplace in the US and into the Canadian marketplace. And so at that time, there was this whole new framework that was really trying to communicate a well-rounded set of values and principles and performance targets to improve the environmental and sustainability performance of the construction industry. So I came on board to really help the studio and our clients understand what that meant for them in terms of design and construction, and I guess offered an interdisciplinary perspective and helped really facilitate that for the organization. I've been with the organization for over 18 years now, which is hard to believe. And as we merged with Perkins and Will in 2004, I had the fortunate opportunity to kind of be launched into co-leading Perkins & Will's Global Sustainable Design Initiative. And so I led that for about 15 years, and then I've had some kids and kind of stepped back, and now I'm kind of back in a leadership position now with the global firm. But,
Good.
Part of that journey has always been for the firm, the global firm has always been about environmental stewardship, environmental responsibility, also social responsibility is a huge part of our value set. And in addition, of course, to design excellence. And so, how do all those values come together in the projects that we're designing for all of our clients around the world is kind of top of mind for our entire global practice.
Right. And I find you touch on a number of important things about the commitment that your firm has to environmental issues, social issues, and obviously design excellence. But an observation I would make in my time working with members of Passive House Canada and beyond, our architects really do have an interest in the environment, environmental protection, and they are the ones who are telling me that Passive House Canada and Passive House standards focused on operational carbon are fantastic, but they're not good enough. We need to push on and move into embodied carbon. And so we've taken up the challenge here. And although it's not yet the sixth principle of Passive House building, I'm hopeful that
it's coming. It's coming.
One day, yeah, it's coming, and one day it's going to be there. And I think Passive House Institute is actually working on those things. We haven't waited. We've one of our instructors has designed a plug-in module for our software that helps estimate embodied carbon, and we're now offering a course in that. But it's just wonderful to see the industry pushing the standards rather than government dragging people along.
Well, I would say industry has pushed, firms like ourselves and other collaborators or consultants or some of our competitors have certainly pushed the industry forward. But I would actually say we're at an interesting time where local government, like the City of Vancouver, the provincial government of BC, are really helping push the industry further too, with the BC Energy Step Code, with the City of Vancouver's Zero Emissions Building Plan. We're now at a point where we're not telling our clients that they have to do this. They're saying, well, we actually have to comply. And the kind of the baseline requirement for building within certain jurisdictions in BC has become so much higher. And as a result, our clients are becoming more savvy. They're becoming more aware. Some of our, institutional clients already have mandates for zero carbon buildings. Some of our private developer clients have global policies for looking at carbon from I think first from an operational standpoint. That's probably easiest to drive down. And then they're building the knowledge and capacity to look at, well, what does embodied carbon then mean, as we're able to do as much as possible on the operational side. The next step is looking at the embodied carbon piece and what does that mean? And I think that's where we're trying to help build some knowledge and capacity within our clients is currently on the embodied carbon.
Do you find your clients are fairly sophisticated when it comes to operational embodied carbon issues? Is there a bit of hesitancy? What level of concern is there that they can meet the standards that, for example, the BC STEP code has in place? Is there concern?
Again, depending on who the client is. If our client is an owner and an operator, and that could be a private client versus an institutional client, I think they get the business case. The business case is clear, because if they're going to own and operate that building for 50 years, there will be a return on investment. And I think it's about understanding what's a priority for your client and what are the key kind of talking points or pressure points. If it's about operational dollars, well, how do you translate sustainable building design, energy conservation measures into kind of an operational cost conversation? And if we can show that there are savings related to a better performing envelope or better performing mechanical systems like HRV units, cooling systems, then they will appreciate it. Where I think the business case is harder to make is when we're working with a developer client who is then not going to own and operate the building over the long term. They have to understand. Part of building the case is, what are the other benefits that the owner, the occupant, is going to derive from
right.
a higher performance building.
Right.
And often that's harder. Some of them will do it because it's about a regulatory process. Some of them we need to educate about the benefits. But honestly, like, the building regulations are changing so quickly that we're trying to keep our clients, keep them up to speed of what they need to do to meet these requirements.
So one thing I've noticed is the importance of the general public being aware of the benefits of high performance buildings, so that if there is some premium attached to purchasing or to renting in a building that is high performance compared to the one next to it that isn't, that they understand the benefits to them of that, right? Which then helps the developer and the builder who are not going to own and operate, but are simply building and then moving along. So that's a job we all have to really get involved with, is educating the public.
Right, and for some of our developer clients who have large marketing teams that help market the end product, we're seeing their marketing teams come to early design charrettes, visioning sessions, so that they're part of the overall story that is being created for the project. We want to understand who their target market is, what are key values that will resonate with that target market, and then make the connections to what the sustainability story is, or the high performance strategies that we would be looking to integrate into the project.
Right. So it's having this process involved right from the get-go, not an add-on at the end, not something that that you think about after it's too late. It's a process that you're involved with right from the get-go.
I think the most successful projects that we have delivered, the client has set a very strong vision for the project right from the outset, right from the RFP process, which is carried through all stages of design and construction. The stakeholders will, depending on who the stakeholder groups are, they will buy into that vision. That vision or set of objectives will become criteria through which you're going to evaluate measures as you advance through design. They will be tested as you go through cost-cutting exercises. Okay, well, if we cut the solar shades, what's going to impact? How's that going to impact the interior quality of the space? Are you going to overheat? Is there going to be glare for your tenants? Really trying to understand, I guess, the interconnections or the interconnections between, one move may have multiple benefits. And so that's why having a strong vision at the beginning is, I would say, really critical. And that begins with, like, whether it's during the programming phase or the RFP development stage. If the client teams, if there are clients on the call today, I would say, trying to understand before you go out to RFP, what's most important to you from a environmental or sustainability or social sustainability standpoint, and have those values clearly articulated in those RFP documents.
Right, right. So I want to talk about the carbon impact statements in a bit, and how you maybe you can walk us through what that means. But before we get there, and sort of from your own personal perspective, as someone who's from BC in the Vancouver area, you talked a little bit about regulation driving change. I always, I'm an Ontario boy, and I always look to BC and think, why can't we do that here? Ever since I was a little kid, BC has always been the place that you look to for green, quote unquote, green. And so I always ask people, why is that? I think I have some answers now that I've spent a fair amount of time in BC over the past 8 months anyway. But why is that? And what can people in other provinces maybe learn from the BC mentality, we'll say?
Well, that's a tough question. I think a lot of people in BC have a true connection to the outdoors and appreciation for the natural assets of British Columbia, whether it's the forests on Vancouver Island or the mountains, the clean water. We have a high quality of life in BC. And that's not to say that Ontarians don't have a high quality of life, but I think people generally have a very high quality of life in this part of the world and across Canada. And I think people really appreciate how clean it is, the protection of our parks, and what that means for helping regulate our climate, regulating or protecting habitat for many different wildlife species, from grizzlies to moose to cougars to owls or to eagles, to whatever your preferred species is. But I think we have a long history of we do have a long history of environmental activism within BC. I think Greenpeace came out of the Pacific Northwest. The protests back in the 90s for Clayoquot Sound, that was a huge, when I was graduating from high school, the protests on Vancouver Island to protect old growth forests was certainly has had a lasting impact on my career or my professional trajectory, probably similar to what we saw last fall in terms of the climate strikes happening all around the world and led by Greta Thunberg. The protests here in the 90s around protection of the rainforest and the old growth was tremendous. And just from personal travel on Vancouver Island and elsewhere in BC, you could see the devastation from different forestry practices, and that the forestry industry has changed over time. And the forestry industry is working more in collaborations with local communities and First Nations groups. So there is a greater sense of appreciation for that industry and the resources, that kind of the balancing of environmental protection and the economy, because the forestry industry is certainly central to the BC economy. So, it's understanding that balance and what is that right balance between kind of forestry practices and conservation.
Right, right.
Bit
Well,
of a
and
long-winded answer.
no, that's quite all right. It's when you when I've asked that question and I'm in BC, people will take me outside and say, just look, you
Yeah,
know,
well, yeah,
we have forests, we have clean air, we have, and that's not to say that Ontario has all of that except the mountains, but there just seems to be a connectiveness to nature
mhm,
that some of us wish we had more of, and
right. And I
you
also
know.
have to say, for the green building industry, there's been a healthy competition in the early days, in like the early 2000s, between Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland about mandating LEED. So LEED was coming into the marketplace in the early 2000s, and there was this kind of rivalry happening on the Pacific, in the Pacific Northwest, about which city was doing what. Are we mandating gold? Are we mandating silver? And it was a healthy rivalry, which I think created kind of a groundswell movement of green building
Mhm.
practitioners within the Pacific Northwest. And I think the Pacific Northwest as a whole, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, has certainly been leading the green building industry from a kind of policy standpoint, from an advocacy standpoint, and a project delivery standpoint for all of North America. I would say cities like New York are certainly on the eastern seaboard, pushing the boundaries. I mean, the city of Toronto is also doing great things now as well.
With the it's green, it's a Toronto green
Green
stamp.
building standard, yeah.
And I do like to point out to my friends in Vancouver and give them a little tweak every now and then that the city of Hamilton, it will probably have more passive house buildings in the coming couple of years than Vancouver. It's just it's great how they've adopted
Hmm.
that. The Toronto Community Housing Corporation, which is the second largest social housing provider in North America, second only to New York, is moving ahead with hundreds and hundreds of buildings that will be EnerFit remodeled in
Right.
the coming few years, which will transform the marketplace, quite frankly. If you're
Hmm.
someone who manufactures windows, you are going to make sure that you have high performance, even passive house standard windows, because they'll be buying tens of thousands of them in the next few years. So marketplace transformation is key. A little rivalry is a good thing, though, between our cities, and to keep us all on our toes. So, Kathy, can you walk us through a sort of a typical carbon impact statement process? How you've touched a little bit. Maybe there is no typical one, quite frankly. I saw you smile, but what does it look like? A client comes to you, or
What
that
are we
you.
doing? Yeah.
What are you doing? How do you do it?
Well, I guess I'll maybe back up just for 1 second. So last fall, with all the climate strikes, we decided to set, every fall in our planning sessions, we set strategic action plan goals for ourselves. And so we established one to move forward with doing carbon impact statements for all of our projects moving forward, recognizing that as we drive down operational carbon, the embodied piece gets bigger and bigger, and we don't really have a good handle on what that looks like for the different projects we're delivering in the different market sectors. So we invested time through our research and residence program to do a literature review of kind of key leading studies out there in the marketplace. Uh, what targets are organizations setting for themselves? And then just take a moment to reflect on, what do we want to set an embodied carbon reduction target for ourselves, or do we want to benchmark our portfolio first, like over the last 2 years in different key market sectors, and say, okay, how are we building, or how are we delivering high-rise residential buildings, institutional buildings? Do we see a trend in the materials that we're using? And do we see a trend in how far we can drive down embodied carbon? So that was a bit of the basis for this idea of a carbon impact statement. And so on Earth Day, we launched our embodied carbon primer document, which is really targeted to provide client more or less our clients and our studio team a high level overview of the key issues around embodied carbon, because all the research out there are 200 to 300 page reports, and our clients honestly are not going to read them. So how do you distill all of that technical information to something that's easily digestible for our clients? So that was another kind of aim of the piece of work. So now what we're doing in like early design, so concept design or schematic design, we're saying to our clients, we will document or produce something what we're calling as the carbon impact statement. We will take early kind of energy use information based on your programming requirements and predict or project what energy use intensity number is for you. We will also work with our structural engineers to take proposed structural solutions or structural systems and model for you through different LCA tools what the embodied carbon implications are of those structural system options that we're looking at. And then, how can we drive them down? So a couple of our projects are pursuing the Canada Green Building Council Net Zero Carbon Standard version 2, which has an embodied carbon target of 20%. So how do you reach that 20%? We know that structure and envelope typically represent about 80% of your embodied carbon emissions for a building. So looking at those kind of two key components and what are the biggest opportunities to reduce the embodied carbon emissions is something that we're trying to explore, work with our consultants. We can't do this alone, to be honest. We need to it's a collaborative effort. And then once we begin to understand where we can have the biggest impact, as we move through design, we will be refining our specifications to specify materials that have low embodied carbon. We'll be working with our contractors to understand what we can do from a concrete supplier standpoint, what we can do from understanding where steel is going to be sourced from around the world. That will have an impact. What type of wood we want to use, and the forestry practices associated with the different wood products we want to use. All of those factors will inform the embodied carbon metric, essentially. So right now we're kind of producing these carbon impact statements as part of our conceptual or schematic design reports for our clients to give them the whole life carbon perspective of the design at that point in time.
And this allows them, and they get this early enough on that they can, it can guide them in their choices, I would imagine.
It can guide them. It can guide our design team. It can open up the conversation with our contractors as we get to later stages of the design process. Right now, we have, some of our contractors are on board very early on in the design process, which is awesome, to be honest, because we can open up that conversation around materials, supply chain issues. What are they seeing in kind of the supply side of the market?
Yeah. Okay. So what's the biggest challenge you face in putting a carbon impact statement together, working with your clients and in-house? What would you say is the biggest challenge for you?
I think right now we're just I don't see any huge challenges. It's more about building capacity within our team and also trying to decipher the data. The data is quite complex, and trying to understand which is the best tool to use. There are a number of tools out there. They all rely on different sets of different data sets and environmental product declarations. And so just trying to navigate through which are the better tools to use at which design stage. So tools like the Athena Impact Estimator and Tally are great for kind of whole building LCA, life cycle assessment analysis. And then later on, like in construction documents, using a tool like the EC3 carbon calculator for individual products can help inform embodied carbon of different products and inform our specifications. So different tools have different uses or purposes or benefits at different stages of the design process.
Right.
So it's not easy, and it's complex. So we're trying to make a complex process simple for our teams and for our clients to understand. And we're doing this regardless of whether our clients are bringing it to the table or not.
Right, right. And I mean, you talked about understanding materials. We had Chris Magwood from the Endeavor Center on a week ago. You know, he spent an entire year peeling back the layers of onions to try and really understand the embodied content of a variety of different building materials available in Canada. And even after a solid year of study, he's got a pretty good metric put together, but then things can change or things can shift. But a solid year of work just to try and understand all of the well, the key materials, building materials that are out there that that can be used. So it's complex. I often say Passive House. If you look at the Passive House principles, it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. It's pretty easy. Well, it is to understand the principles, but to implement them is darn difficult. You know, you need to know what you're doing. And, you know, yours is similar. Embodied carbon is similar. It's a lot of that groundwork that's being done now that Passive House folks have been doing for many years to get us to where we are today. But certainly a lot more needs to be done to incorporate that knowledge, the embodied carbon knowledge, into Passive House standards. So we're pushing on that.
Yeah, and I would just say, like, right now, I think the results from this process are giving us a range of magnitude of the impact of embodied carbon associated with different system choices. We may not have an exact answer, but it's giving us a range, a kind of a magnitude of impact. And I think for us right now, that's really important as we begin to understand, you know, if we want to set a very concrete, specific target for ourselves and for our portfolio, we need to kind of understand where we can, what materials are available within the supply chain, where we can have the biggest impact, where are hurdles from a client acceptance delivery standpoint. So we're kind of in this period of time where it's a bit of building knowledge capacity for ourselves and for our clients. And, you know, we have certainly clients that are very keen to be part of the journey. Let's call it a journey right now. In understanding their impact, they may be benchmarking their own portfolio. And so this information will just help them out from a reporting standpoint as well.
Right. So do I understand? It sounds to me that that the whole carbon impact statement is as. Am I wrong in saying it's as much about Perkins and Will and what it needs to do with the buildings that it designs? As much that it's as much a corporate commitment that your firm has made as it is to work with clients coming in to talk to you about buildings or work with you on buildings. So there's two drivers here. There's working with the developer to make sure they get low carbon, but it's also from a corporate perspective that that's driving it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of our sustainability initiative firm-wide, we've committed to the AIA 2030 challenge to drive down energy use. The AIA 2030 does have a new commitment out there around driving down embodied carbon. We haven't yet signed on. I think this benchmarking process is really to help us test the tools and understand how far we can get. Can we get to the AIA 2030 embodied carbon reduction targets? We have 2,600 people around our firm, and so we want to make sure if we commit to a commit globally to a embodied carbon target, we want to make sure that it's within reach for our teams and for our clients. So that's this process that we're undertaking in the Vancouver studio is certainly going to inform a potential kind of a global mandate moving forward.
And I'll just let anyone who's online know that in a minute we'll open up the line, so to speak, and take any questions you might have for Kathy. You talked earlier, Kathy, about changing regulations, I would imagine, around building codes, etc. We know the BC STEP code has certainly led the way, and it it is being adopted. What are those regulatory changes or challenges you see outside of BC or even within BC for clients?
Um, Regulatory challenge. I mean, I think when the step code and I'll just come back to the city for the city of
Right.
Vancouver and BC for a minute. When those two policies came into place, we actually made a commitment to invite individual client groups into our studio, and we provided kind of one-on-one education sessions for those clients. Uh, let's call it in a safe environment, so that if clients and their kind of internal teams had questions that they wanted to ask about what it meant for kind of a construction delivery process from a design standpoint, they could ask those questions in a very safe environment. And I think sometimes clients don't want to look or ask an awkward question in front of a whole group of their peers or peer developer groups. So, we offered a series of kind of workshops for our clients, and I think that was fairly well received in just helping build capacity in terms of what it meant. And
Mm-hmm.
I think any time that jurisdictions, whether it's in BC or across Canada, um, bring new policy into place, it's really important to kind of have a peer network where they can consult. Like, stakeholder consultation is really critical to informing any new regulatory process coming into place, to
Mm-hmm.
test the waters, what's working, what's not working, what's going to be the business case, what are anticipated barriers to adoption. The Vancouver Economic Commission in Vancouver has certainly done a lot of business case studying to understand what the economic impact is of the BC Step Code from a, I guess, supporting and building the industry. As you said, if there's a higher performance regulation, Windows suppliers better get on board. You don't want to be a laggard. You don't want to miss out on the opportunity. And so the Vancouver Economic Commission did do kind of a financial impact of the BC Step Code in terms of generating jobs and supporting industry locally.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's about being mindful about who the stakeholders are in the broader community, and making sure that I would say you pilot or test, or you kind of workshop what those potential requirements are before they actually come into market, so that you've got market buy-in before they're launched.
Before the launch, yeah. So what do you think? I mentioned earlier about the need to get buy-in from the public, and as well touched on. There seems to be higher awareness in BC about environmental issues. What do you think we need to be doing, though, as a design sector to raise awareness among people? Do you have any ideas, any suggestions for all of us? What could we be doing out there to talk about the importance of high performance buildings?
I guess sometimes we often talk to like-minded organizations or like-minded professional associations, whether it's, architects talking to architects at the RIIC event or the CAGBC event or Passive House event. But if you have the opportunity to talk to different organizations, whether it's the Board of Trade, or whether it's the Real Estate Foundation, or it's even schools. So I've been talking, even amongst, I'm a parent of 3 kids, I've been talking about what it means to design healthy schools and healthy workplaces to the board of directors, to staff, and to students. And it's about educating different groups who you don't typically reach out to on a day-to-day basis. And so just being mindful about, I guess, who you're reaching out to, where you're presenting, and is there any opportunity to reach out to a broader, more diverse organization?
Mm-hmm. Good. And how are you feeling about where the country is going in terms of its greenhouse gas commitments, its climate crisis commitments? Wearing your mum hat even. How are you feeling about the progress we're making or not making?
I think In Canada, we're doing pretty well compared to some of my colleagues who live and work in the United States. I would say we have a favorable uh, national government and provincial governments that are kind of supporting the industry. I think we can, we can always do more, but I think I always try and balance the business perspective too. Through all of this, thinking about just even coming out of this pandemic, we, the economy's halted. There is a concern that the economy could rebound, and we will totally forget about all the efforts that we've made in terms of energy conservation or kind of business efficiency, and we will kind of rebound with a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. But I think the opportunity for us is that we have so many tools at our fingertips today, like Passive House, like the LEED Green Building Rating System, all the modeling software at our fingertips. How do we kind of rebound our economy out of this period of time in a really strategic way that could, I don't know, reset our trajectory for the next 10, 15, 20 years in a really healthy, sustainable way? I think people have been really mindful during this time about understanding the impact of our global economy and supply chain issues. And there's been a bit more of a kind of a refocus on supporting local economies, local industry. And in turn, that certainly has a benefit in terms of, lowering our embodied carbon footprint for our projects as well.
Right, good. So I mean, you've mentioned the green the green relaunch of our economy, and we certainly are in
green recovery. Yeah,
the green recovery. We are certainly interested in that, and been talking to governments across the country about the need to invest in that type of green recovery that as you say, will set the trajectory for the next 20 to 50 years. And with our emphasis on buildings, we certainly know that governments are not going to meet their greenhouse gas emission commitments unless they focus on buildings.
Yeah,
just important. So, so Stephanie, I don't see any questions just yet. I think Kathy and I have done a great job of answering just. Am I wrong?
No, there are no questions. So that's like, I would give you a 100% perfect mark on this one.
Well, I'm not sure.
It has to be the quality interviewer that's asked all the questions or something like that. But it is fascinating. So I've carried on our conversation a little bit longer than we normally do, Kathy.
That's all right.
But I like to give the last question to you. Is there anything that I've missed? Is there any question you want to ask or answer? Any statement you want to make?
Yeah. When we think about, I think, Passive House, like all these organizations, whether it's Passive House, LEED, all the kind of rating systems out there, we're all aligned in a common objective in terms of designing healthier, more energy efficient, low carbon buildings. And I think we all need to kind of work together on a common trajectory to realize those end goals. And we have the tools. The science is clear. We need to do something differently. And we know that for all of us who are on the call today, our buildings have a huge impact. And I think every day that we wake up, we just need to know that what we do from a design standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, can have a positive impact, can help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, even if it's 5, 10, 15%. We don't have to wake up saying, okay, I'm going to design all zero carbon buildings tomorrow. I mean, ideally, we'd want to get there. But, if we can even just start to open up that conversation about how we can drive down emissions, it will have a collective impact moving forward. And I am hopeful. I mean, we're not going to be able to reverse all of our emissions, but I think, driving them down and being more mindful of that on a day-to-day basis is really critical as we move forward.
Good. And I was ahead of myself when I said there were no questions. My statement saying there were no questions generated some questions. So Stephanie, do you want me to take those, or do you want to pull them out?
Certainly, if you want to ask those questions, or I can. So the first question is, what is the, so we've got a question here. What alternatives to structures do you foresee as low embodied carbon besides mass timber?
Well, I guess it's going to depend on the scale of building that you're designing, right? There are going to be some buildings that concrete will be part of the solution, or steel, and just looking at those kind of three main structural material choices, there's opportunities within all of them to reduce embodied carbon. And so it's understanding what are the opportunities. If you have to build with concrete, how far can you reduce your embodied carbon? If steel is part of your building, what are the opportunities to reduce that? So where is the supplier located? Is the steel manufactured using coal-fired energy plant? That will have a huge impact on your embodied carbon. Even if you use mass timber, it's important to understand, are you going to be encapsulating that mass timber from a fire suppression standpoint? The encapsulation will add to your embodied carbon footprint. So there's considerations for every material that we need to look at, but it's being mindful about what are those considerations, and opening up that dialogue with the consultants, with the trades, with your contractor.
Yeah, good.
Great. Another question was, can you remind everyone about the document that has been released? What is it? What's the title of that document?
The document is called an Embodied Carbon Primer by Perkins and Will. I believe it's on our website. I can certainly circulate it to Chris and to you, Stephanie, if you would like to circulate it. We have what's a kind of a primer document that's probably about 20 something pages, and then a executive summary of that, which kind of really is the high level distillation of the key points.
Right.
Great. And as small architecture firms struggling with navigating all of the green rating systems, how do we help make those better?
How do we make those better? That's a good question. I would stick to one or two key that are most reflective of your client's values. I would say LEED is certainly still a very well-rounded overarching rating system. Passive House is one that very much targets kind of a low energy design, thermal comfort. So depending on what your client's needs are, or what your values are as an organization, there may be one or two that are better suited to the types of projects that you're designing. There's also the WELL building standard that's primarily focused on just health and well-being of the building occupants, and that may be a good fit. So there's no easy answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Especially if it's
okay.
a that lacks capacity.
Yeah, and there are small sustainability consulting firms that could probably provide that service. If you are a smaller architecture firm, and maybe bring that in as a sub-consultant to your project team in different pursuits, would be maybe another way to tackle the rating system issue.
Yeah, good
Who
point.
have the capacity, the knowledge, the tools to kind of administer that process.
Excellent, excellent, good answer.
Good.
I think
and that's it.
That's
okay.
it, Stephanie.
Yeah.
Well, well. Listen, Kathy, thank you very much. I've learned an awful lot. I had read the executive summary of the primer. I'm now going to go back and start wading through the more fulsome document, and it taught me an awful lot. So I appreciate Perkins and Will's taking the initiative to bring that to the marketplace, and I do believe it is on your website. And if not, we'll make sure that anyone who wants
I'll double check that. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll make sure that happens. So thank you once again, and congratulations with the carbon impact statement and the work that your firm is doing. And we'll leave it there for now, other than to say be safe. Thank you very much. Look forward to meeting you in person one day when we're all getting back to some travel.
Great.
Good.
Nice talking with you, Chris. Take care.
Okay, take care. And I will turn off our cameras now. And before you go, I just want us to move along. A couple more slides in the offing. I want to tell folks that Of course, this is Embodied Carbon Month at our show. And we take embodied carbon seriously, so seriously, in fact, that we've launched how to identify and drive down embodied carbon in buildings for Passive House folks. Our first offering begins July 30th. So if you are interested, and perhaps if you're from a small architectural firm that needs to better understand embodied carbon, this might be a low-cost course for you to take. And our next building conversations takes place, we're skipping next week, and we're going to, for the summer, we're going to do every couple of weeks throughout the summer. Building conversations next week, or not next week, Wednesday, July the 15th, is with Mayor Laurie Ackerman from Fort St. John, BC. And Mayor Ackerman is a big proponent of Passive House buildings. So it will be interesting to hear from her perspective about why council and staff is focused on high performance buildings, what the benefits are, what the challenges are to having those built in her community. And I will move to the last slide and just again thank everyone for being on today's show. Look forward to seeing you July the 15th for our next show. Thanks for your attention, and thanks for your commitment to learning about high performance buildings and learning more about Passive House standards and Passive House Canada. Please visit our website or drop us an email if you want to learn more. We have all sorts of resources on our website for you to explore and learn more about Passive House. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good week. Have a safe week. We'll see you July 15th. Bye for now.